So that is the comparison between abdominal and thoracic. But however, with the advent of endovascular therapy by Joan Parodi, later Michael Dake in Stanford, I think more than 90% of all pathologies in thoracic aorta, except in ascending aorta because of the complex valve and coronary problem, are dealt with endovascular therapy. That is the recent evolution, and that is really worked out for thoracic aorta. Now, there are four pathologies apart from trauma, that is the aneurysm, dissection, penetrating ulcer, and the intramural hematoma. But what we are discussing today, we'll start with Siddharth on aortic dissection. Most probably you concentrate on Stanford B dissection. That's what our domain is. Then, of course, followed by thoracic, thoracoabdominal by Shivanation. And we have Murali working on hybrid arcs and all the how to do that. So I think I shall straight away go for Dr. Siddharth to talk on aortic dissection. Dr. Siddharth, please.
Thank you, sir. Is my screen seen?
Yes.
Okay, so good evening all. My talk will be on aortic dissections. I'll try to briefly give you the overview of this particular clinical entity, how it clinically presents, and how we go about decision making in its management. So some of you may already be knowing what a dissection is. It basically is a phenomenon in which there's a tear in the intimal layer of the arterial wall, and you have a propagation of blood into the layers of the arterial wall. So this creates a false plane or false lumen. So when this occurs in the aorta, it's known as aortic dissection, and this is one of the most common acute catastrophes of the aorta. It comes as a part of the clinical spectrum of what is known as acute aortic syndrome, like Uni sir already mentioned, the others being intramural hematoma, penetrating aortic ulcer, and stable thoracic aneurysms. So what exactly is the pathogenesis of an aortic dissection? So the tear happens in the intimal layers of the aorta, and blood now enters into the layers of the aortic wall. When this happens, you now have a false lumen developing and blood flowing in the intraluminal space. You can see that in the picture on the side. Now this false lumen actually has a weaker wall, so it tends to expand. As it expands, it compresses the true lumen and can create malperfusion of the organs distally. Also, with the expanding false lumen with a thin wall, it can chronically become an aneurysm. So classically, these entry tears occur at sites where there is excessive hydraulic stress or shear stress on the aortic wall. So one typical location is the lateral wall of the ascending aorta because of the jet of the LV pushing against that site. The other common location is after it takes the arch of the aorta at the site where the ligamentum is attached. It's a relatively fixed location known as isthmus of the aorta. So that is the second site where commonly we see a tear. So there's also multiple re-entry tears occurring distally in the aorta where blood tends to re-enter the true lumen space. So pathognomically, you have two classical features, that is the entry tear and the intramomedial flap. And the intramomedial flap may be located most commonly, actually it's seen in the ascending aorta, 65% cases, 25% in the descending aorta, and less commonly in the aortic arch. Now, as far as etiology is concerned, the most common risk factors we tend to see is hypertension and increasing age. These cause a particular pathology known as cystic medial necrosis, which predisposes the aorta to dissection. It's more common in males, and it's also seen more commonly when there is various structural anomalies like bicuspid aortic valve or coarctation. Certain genetic conditions like connective tissue disease like Marfan's and Ehlers-Danlos predispose patients to having a dissection, and trauma is again another common cause. So coming to the classification, there are two classical or well-known classifications for aortic dissection, that is the DeBakey and the Stanford classification. The DeBakey classification is classified as type 1 if you have a dissection from the ascending and the descending aorta, type 2 if it is limited to the ascending aorta, and a type 3 dissection if it is limited to descending aorta. Again, in the type 3, you have a type 3A for the thoracic and a type 3B for thoracic and abdominal. But for a more practical standpoint, as far as treatment is concerned, we follow the Stanford classification, So Stanford A is that the dissection involving the ascending aorta, and Stanford B if it only involves the descending aorta. As far as the timeline is concerned, if the patient presents acutely within 2 weeks, it's called as acute dissection, and if it's within 2 to 6 weeks subacute, and more than 6 weeks is chronic. Again, clinically, we classify these patients as complicated dissections if they also present with intractable pain, having organ malperfusion, rupture or rapid expansion of the false lumen, or if they have uncontrolled hypertension in spite of treatment. So coming to the clinical features, there's a classical feature known as the aortic pain, which these patients often have as a symptom. So that is basically a very intense sort of a tearing kind of a pain which they experience. If it occurs retrosternally or towards the neck, it may be associated with an ascending aortic dissection. And descending aortic dissections are more often having back pain or interscapular pain. If patients have symptoms related to cardio-aortic complications like AR or cardiac tamponade because of bleeding into the pericardial space, or coronary ischemia causing cardiac ischemic syndromes, this is a more sinister clinical finding. Another dangerous symptom is the presence of organ malperfusion if any branches get involved by the dissection. So this can cause stroke, renal failure, abdominal pain due to mesenteric angina or acute limb ischemia. So in examination, we find that most of these patients tend to be hypertensive and can also have a pulse deficit between the upper limb and the lower limb pulses. This is because of dissection pathology affecting the aorta. It's uncommon to see hypotension, but this may be seen in type A dissections. Patient can also have bruit in the carotids of the femorals and features of organ ischemia. So there's an entity known as malperfusion syndrome. So this is basically if the dissection affects a particular aortic branch and compromises its blood circulation. So this can cause an end organ ischemia to that particular organ. So it's classified as dynamic or static. Dynamic means that particular branch is not actually involved by a pathology, but because of the prolapse of the dissection flap, as you can see in this picture, into the ostium, it may compromise the flow into the particular vessel. So this usually is relieved by treating the dissection itself and improving flow into the true lumen. On the contrary, you can have what is known as a static dissection. So this is when there is a dissection actually affecting the branch itself, can have a thrombosis or avulsion of the branch as well. So this will not be treated by merely treating the dissection. You have to also give direct intervention to the particular branch. How do we go about diagnosing? So we tend to use what is known as a triple rule out investigating modality. That is often patients are first, we have to rule out a coronary syndrome using echo, ECG, and enzymes. And if that is negative, the next thing is to take a CT aortogram to rule out the possibility of an embolism versus aortic dissection. So as far as dissections are concerned, CT angiograms are the gold standard investigation. It gives us almost all the necessary information. You can confirm the diagnosis. As you can see in picture 1, there is a dissection in the ascending and the descending with the intimal flap. You can also classify as a type A and type B, and you can see the extent. You can distinguish the true and the false lumen, also see which all branches are involved. As far as treatment principles are concerned, the timely diagnosis is the most important thing, appropriate referral in the appropriate time so that patient gets the treatment at the earliest. Defining the extent of the dissection, looking for any complication features, and then promptly initiating the patient on an antihypertensive therapy. So that's the first line of therapy that you initiate. So why antihypertensives? It basically stabilizes the ongoing dissection. It reduces the flap mobility. And in that way, it also relieves a component of the dynamic obstruction to distal branches. And of course, it can also decrease the risk of rupture. So this medical therapy is also known as Wheaton-Palmer regimen or anti-impulse therapy. So what are we trying to do is reduce the systolic BP and the pressure gradient across the aorta, the dP by dt. This is achieved by giving IV beta blockers and vasodilators. And we try to achieve a BP goal of around systolic BP of around 100 to 110 millimeter mercury. And this also helps in relieving the pain. Treatment, of course, doesn't stop at that. We have to keep the patient at ongoing imaging because to see what is happening with the dissection. Now, type A dissection is a different scenario. This is a catastrophic event and patient's mortality increases by the hour. So for these patients, they need to be referred for an urgent surgical repair, which is often a cardiac surgery. Like you can see in the picture, the ascending aorta may be replaced with or without a valve repair. This particular one done in the picture is known as a Bentall procedure. The procedure itself is complicated and has high mortality risk, but it is a life-saving procedure in such a scenario. For type B dissections, the picture is a little different. We don't jump in and intervene immediately. So for acute stable dissections, we often treat medically, like I explained before. We may offer them TEVAR. If the patient has complicated dissections like a rupture event or malperfusion syndrome, we offer them immediate endovascular repair or that is TEVAR. And in chronic situations, we may continue medical therapy or give them TEVAR or surgical option. So what the TEVAR does is basically it endoseals the entry tear. So you can see in that picture, the stent graft closes off the entry tear. So this achieves expansion of the true lumen, restoration of normal flow in the distal organs, and obliteration of the flow into the false lumen so that it can get thrombosed subsequently. So this is known as positive aortic remodeling. So that is what we're looking for. In the case of malperfusion syndromes, as you can see in the central picture, the celiac and the SMA are actually malperfused because of the dissection prolapse. So that's a dynamic event. So in such a case, just by treating the dissection or doing a TEVAR across the entry tear, as you can see here, it will improve flow in the true lumen and the celiac and SMA will get perfused. If you don't have access to emergency TEVAR, you can also do what is known as a fenestration, as seen here, basically doing a balloon opening into the septum so that there is some improved flow into the true lumen and these organs gets perfused. This is not an ideal procedure, but may be done if there is no other option. For static obstructions, that is, you can see for the left renal here, this particular vessel is actually torn off from the true lumen. So this is an avulsion, or you can also have thrombosis. So such arteries will need to be tackled individually or stented. So this is a case where the left renal has been stented directly, or if you can't stent, the other option is to do a bypass. So this is an IU SMA bypass done for an SMA static obstruction. The Stable 2 clinical trial published recently showed that there was good efficacy with endovascular repair for acute type B dissections. You can see that the immediate mortality, stroke rate, renal failure risks are pretty acceptable in 5 to 7%. And the long-term false lumen thrombosis also was pretty high. In chronic type B dissections, what happens is the false lumen starts getting aneurysmal. Again, the treatment principles are pretty much the same. You want to close off the entry tear so that the true lumen flow is restored. And you do that by TEVAR, as you see in the first picture. The second picture is what's known as a hybrid TEVAR, which is also done if the situation calls for that. Details of this will be talked about by the third speaker, Dr. Murli sir, in his talk. Open repair is again another option. This is usually done in high volume centers with experience and requires complex cardiopulmonary bypass like total circulatory arrest. So as you can see, the same principle applies. We unify the true and false lumen and finally stitch a graft and repair the aorta at that particular segment. So this is a patient who has undergone an open repair for thoracic aortic dissection. So in the clinical algorithm, basically what is done is acute dissections are treated emergently either by stent grafting or particular vessel stenting, depending on the malperfusion situation. Type A dissections are treated with open surgery, cardiac surgery, while type B dissections, the uncomplicated type B dissections usually are treated just by medical therapy with antihypertensive regimen. Some patients may be offered stent graft in this acute phase itself, and there is increasing evidence from these particular trials to say that this is also gives a good long-term result. I'll try to recap the whole thing by using a few case scenarios. So this is a 52-year-old gentleman who had presented with who's hypertensive, presented with 3 days history of acute back pain and a feeling of uneasiness in his chest. He was found to be very hypertensive when he presented in the casualty, but there was no other systemic findings. His ECG, chest X-ray, echo all turned out to be normal, so it is not a cardiac event. And when a CT angiogram was taken, it clinched the diagnosis of type B dissection, and he was treated with antihypertensive therapy. A little more elderly gentleman with CAD had 2 days history of acute abdominal pain. Initially had a history of chest pain to begin with. On presentation, has a tender abdomen. Another finding that was found was that his one lower limb pulse was slightly weaker than the other. So investigating for the acute abdomen, a CECT was taken, and actually it found out that there was a dissection in the aorta with malperfusion of the visceral arteries, the SMA. So this particular patient underwent a TEVAR and his SMA dynamic obstruction relieved. Yet another case of a young lady who had no other particular comorbidities but was marfanoid in her habitus. had central chest pain and a brief period of collapse for 2 hours. She was brought to ER, found to be hypertensive, no cardiac STT changes, but an echo showed that she had a flap in her ascending aorta, which was confirmed to be a type A dissection on a CT angiogram, and she underwent an emergency Bentall procedure. So to summarize, an aortic dissection is a cardiovascular emergency, needs prompt diagnosis. Some classical symptoms and signs to look for is the aortic pain and the coexisting hypertension. A CT angiogram is the diagnostic modality of choice, and it also helps plan the intervention. Type A dissections need emergency cardiac surgery. Type B dissections, on the other hand, are predominantly treated medically with antihypertensive therapy to begin with, or you may offer them TEVAR according to the clinical setting, while complicated dissections, chronic dissections often need interventions, usually in the form of endovascular therapy. So thank you.
Yeah, very comprehensive and very excellent presentation, Siddharth. You have covered the topic extremely well. There is very little to add. I think even while you were in Srijitra, you would have seen we have managed a few cases. One or two small thing to add is in the Stanford A dissection, most important thing is 30 to 35% patients will die with or without diagnosis. Thereafter, you have 1% mortality for 48 hours. To the extent at the end of 15 days, you have hardly 5 to 6% alive without intervention. That is one, that's just a little initial thing, it's not mentioned. Otherwise, I think you have covered everything. There's another group who come with, and even we have treated at least 2 patients who had hemothorax, Stanford B dissection, and rupture. The tricky thing is that we don't know exactly which point is given way. So there, usually what we have done is, we have done a carotid and gone for a zone 1 deployment of the stent graft to the middle chest, because we don't know whether there will be a retrograde effect if you don't cover antegrade properly. So that at least one patient's name I remember, Vikram, and I think you were there, Siddha, at that time. He is coming for follow-up. He came with a rupture 5th day of the event. So, yes. And then he was dyspneic and severe chest pain, survived, and God's grace, he is doing well even now. So otherwise, I think what you've said is right. One more thing to add is, in the case of, now earlier we used to do fenestration. Now what is done is, if possible, if you have adequate grafts and covered stents, you can have a fenestration of 8 millimeter, put in a 10 mm covered stent from true lumen across intimal flap to the arterial lumen, so that later on when we reconstruct the aorta, the remodeling will be better. Otherwise, what happens is this will start off another dissection. But of course, life has to be sustained before you talk about an increase in diameter after 1 year. So fenestration is adequate, but there's another technique which is in hand in not in all centers, but in where we have all the gadgetries ready with us. I think excellent presentation. I think you can ask Asi or Vimal, Sunil to comment. Very good lucid presentation.
Shall we go on with the next talk, sir? Then we can do the discussion all together.
Yes, okay.
Yes. So I'll play Shiva's presentation next.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving this wonderful opportunity to talk about basics of thoracoabdominal aortic aneurysms, its presentation and management. So as per definition, these are aneurysms which are extending on either side of the diaphragm, involving both the thoracic and the abdominal cavity, and to the various extent of visceral and renal arteries. So it is one of the most complex aneurysms to manage. And etiology, most common is atherosclerosis, occupying more than 80% of these patients, followed by dissection and connective tissue disorders like Marfan's and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. This is a common classification that we use called as modified Crawford classification. It's classified into type 1 to type 5 based on the extent. As we see here, type 2 is the most extensive one, almost starting from base of subclavian up to the aortic bifurcation. And type 1 and type 5 doesn't involve the renal arteries. They may be asymptomatic, detected routinely during any other investigation. Most common symptom is pain, either chest or back pain based on the extent. Sometimes compulsive symptoms like breathing difficulty because of bronchial compression or dysphagia can also happen. We usually wait for up to 6 centimeters in patients who are asymptomatic because the morbidity associated with intervention is more compared to the rate of rupture. So we in asymptomatic patients, in symptomatic patients, we usually intervene by 5.5 centimeters also. So baseline investigation will be chest X-ray, where it shows the enlargement of aortic shadows, and then CT angio is the investigation of choice. It helps in planning and also knowing the extent of the aneurysm. But if the renal parameters are deranged, then we go for MR angiogram without contrast. So before planning for any intervention, we usually take a preoperative assessment, cardiac and respiratory. Basically, CAG and pulmonary function tests are done. They are properly optimized, and then we are taking up for surgery. 3 options are there. One is open, then endovascular, pure endovascular, or hybrid repair, combination of open and endovascular. So in open repair, we replace the part, we clamp the aorta, replace the aneurysmal segment with the graft, and we reimplant the visceral and renal arteries. The goals are a modality of treatment. Technically is very challenging, mainly because of the extensive nature of the surgery, because we need to have access to compartments. Thoracic and abdominal compartment has to be open. The clamp is very much close to the heart, so it has a high afterload to the heart. And various duration of ischemia is going to happen to the renal arteries, visceral mesenteric arteries, and spinal cord. So basics, coming to the basics, like whenever you do an infrarenal clamp, the afterload does not increase too much because the main buffering system is here bubble mesenteric venous system. It takes up the extra burden of the afterload and shift the blood, takes the extra blood so that the afterload doesn't increases. Whereas when we do a clamp suprahiatal above the mesenteric up to the DTA, this buffering system, buffering action of the mesenteric is not there, so it's going to increase both the afterload and also the preload. So that's why these surgeries are more complicated. So word about spinal cord blood supply, we have 2 arteries, one anterior spinal artery and set of posterior spinal artery. Anterior spinal artery usually supplies the motor area. But one problem with the anterior spinal artery, it is not a continuous artery. It is usually made by multiple collaterals from the vertebral, intercostal, lumbar arteries. And one of the major artery which is reformed in the anterior spinal artery is the artery of Allen-Kivas. It is basically it is a radical branch of the intercostal artery. Is between T8 to L2. That usually the major vessel there. And cerebral perfusion, to increase cerebral perfusion, we should know this formula. Like the cerebral perfusion is basically it's based on difference between the mean arterial pressure and intracranial pressure. So whenever the mean arterial pressure is high, intracranial pressure is low, the cerebral perfusion and as well as spinal perfusion increases. So what we do is we keep the mean arterial pressure high by keeping the BP high with inotropic supports, and maintain the low CSF by putting a CSF drain and keeping the pressure low. So whenever this difference is maintained, the spinal perfusion increases. So that's what we try to do during surgery. And initial technique was clamp and sew technique, where we clamp the aorta above and below the aneurysm, and then we replace aneurysm with the graft. But this surgery has to be done very fast. Within 30-40 minutes, we have to finish it off. Otherwise, there is high chance of paraplegia and renal failure. So to avoid this distal ischemia, what we do is distal perfusion. So what we do is whenever we are clamping the aorta, the distal aorta is not getting any blood. So we take the blood from the above the clamp or from the heart and give it through the pump to the distal aorta, so that it avoids the ischemia to the renal arteries, visceral arteries, and spinal cord. So that many options are there. One, what we do is a passive shunt, a God shunt, where the aorta is cannulated above the clamp and below the clamp. Through the shunt, the blood is going to flow. This is what routinely we use in our institute also. Aorta is cannulated above, femoral is cannulated below, and through the side limbs we give blood to the visceral and renal arteries. Other option is we have to take the blood from the heart and then give it through the pump, either oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood. We can oxygenate with the cardiac perfusion, pulmonary bypass pump is there, so that we give it to the distal aorta, so that distal perfusion is maintained. This is a positioning of the patient. It's called as modified Stoney's position, where the upper torso is at 60-degree lateral and then lower waist is at 40-degree lateral position. So we have the access both to the chest, abdomen, and as well as the femoral. The surgeon usually stands on the left side of the patient, and then the entry usually between 6th, 7th, or 8th intercostal space based on the extent of the aneurysm, as decided by the CT. Then we have to enter the thorax, cut the diaphragm, and also enter the abdomen. When the patient when the surgeon stands from left side, this is how the axis looks like. So the aorta is opened up like this, and we usually do a sequential clamping. So whenever we are doing a proximal clamp, we clamp just close to the proximal, then we shift the clamp down to include intercostal arteries, then we shift the clamp down to include the viscerals, and finally to the distal end. That's how sequentially we keep shifting the clamp. So here first we will doing the proximal anastomosis, where we are clamping just proximal and distal to the anastomosis, and the blood is taken from the heart, given through the pump, and through this pump it goes to the distal aorta or the femoral. We can either way you can give, and so that when we are doing this anastomosis, there is no distal ischemia. So once the proximal will be done, finished, and then we'll be shifting the clamp down. So here we have opened the whole aorta, and then once the proximal is over, then we have to do intercostal reimplant. The intercostal vessel, whichever is bigger, back bleeding nicely between T8 to L2, will be reimplanted. At the same time, when the visceral and renal arteries will get blood from the pump, side arm of the pump will go to this renal arteries. Sometimes even renal arteries can be, we can perfuse the renal cold saline so that the renal we can maintain the renal perfusion. So once it is done, intercostal is done, then we go for a celiac SMA and renal arteries. So we usually don't see the vessel per se. We can see only the origin when we open the aneurysm. So there are four vessels, four origin orifices will be seen: celiac artery, SMA, and renal, both the renal arteries. All together, they will be included as a single anastomosis, as shown here. All these four vessels can be included as a single anastomosis. We cut the graft accordingly, and then it will be included. Sometimes the left renal artery alone can be separately anastomosed also. Sometimes what we do is, instead of giving all four as a single anastomosis, we can give a separate graft to each of these vessels. It's usually done in Marfan syndrome, but it takes more time, and we don't really prefer to do this kind of procedures. So once it's the final picture, it's a proximal anastomosis, intercostal is given here, and then this left renal artery separately anastomosed, IMA is anastomosed, and it's the distal into the iliac. So based on the extent, the extent of repair is as shown for type 2 from the base of subclavian up to the renal aortic bifurcation, with including the intercostals and visceral and renal arteries. Coming to endovascular repair, in endovascular repair, you put a stent graft within the aneurysm so that it doesn't rupture. But problem here is when we put a stent graft across the visceral and renal artery, it will get occluded. So to prevent that, there are various techniques, something called as parallel grafts and others called as penetrator grafts. In parallel grafts, what we do, the stent graft is the main aortic stent graft is inserted along the sides of the stent graft. Another two small stents are inserted into the renal arteries. So these two stents lie parallel to each other. That's why the name of stents, parallel grafts. Based on the appearance, anatomical deployment, it is called, various names are given. This looks like a chimney, so it's called chimney graft. This looks like a periscope. So that's like periscope and octopus, and these are various terminologies given. Basically, you can see that there are two stent grafts. One is a major aortic stent, the smaller one is the stent grafts going to the visceral and renal. So problem with this is the bigger stent can compress and upload this graft. So routinely it is not used, and the routine preferred modality more nowadays is the fenestration. So what we do is, instead of putting a graft on the side, we make a hole in the aortic stent graft, and through this hole we give we perfuse through the visceral and renal arteries through the other small stents. So these holes can be made custom made by the company can make it custom made for the particular patient, but it will be more costly. So what we prefer to do is, on table the surgeons will fenestrate it based on the where exactly the vessels are oriented. Based on the CT, we make the four holes. About two is for celiac and SMA, and sides is for the renal arteries. So this is the pure endovascular repair. Then comes a hybrid repair. Hybrid is where, instead of putting holes in the stent grafts, we make bypass to these visceral and renal arteries and then put a stent graft. So here we are avoiding aortic cross clamping, and then that's a major morbidity can be avoided with the hybrid repair. So for example, here we can see the renal, from the iliac artery, the bypass is done for the celiac, SMA, and renal arteries, and the stent graft is inserted, so that the fenestration of a stent graft can be avoided in these patients. So in our institute, over a period of 12 years, we have done around 57 cases, predominantly type 3 repair. And morbidities, you can see it is up to 18%. So when compared to triple infernal aneurysm, which is the morbidities have less than 5%, the morbidity also with these procedures are very high, especially because of hemorrhage and other myocardial and respiratory failures can happen. Morbidity wise also, patient will require prolonged ventilatory support, reintubation, tracheostomy can happen even up to 17%, and renal failure that reversible or irreversible can happen up to tune of 30%. Hybrid repair, we have very less experience in our institute. We have done around 7 or 8 cases. For example, this case where we have done only SMA bypass. Celiac was already occluded and we have put a stent graft. And one patient, we replaced the infernal aorta with the bypassing all the 4 vessels and then stent graft for the upper portion. So to conclude, this is very surgically challenging domain, and with centers which routinely do have a better outcome in surgical technique. And then the endovascular treatment evolving, it has better perioperative outcome, but problem is the cost is high and patient has to be on regular follow-up. And then hybrid repair we do only in the selected patients. Thank you.
Shall we go for a discussion after the next presentation, or?
I think so, sir. We can have a combined discussion.
Shall I share the screen?
Yes, sir. Murli sir, over to you, sir.
I think you have to enable me to share my screen.
What's your name? Yendras Murali or Sai Suhas? Okay, I'll make.
Yeah, Sai Suhas. Yeah.
1 minute. Why are you using such names?
No, my son name.
Okay. Okay, now you can do it. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Can you see?
Yes.
Yeah. I thank Professor Unni sir and Team VASC for the opportunity and excellent presentations by Siddharth and Shiva. Shiva, your work is truly inspiring. God bless you. So I'm sharing my brief experience on the aortic arch aneurysms, by which we are done through the hybrid approach. The management modalities for arch aneurysms are, if it is a small or if the patient comorbids are bad, not fit for any procedures, you can just leave them on medical management. Or in a high volume center like Sri Chitra, something like that, open repair is an option. And hybrid aortic debranching and TEVAR is possible in most of the centers, like, and fenestration and other things again in a high volume center, like, in CMC Vellore by George sir. It's very difficult to replicate open repair results of Sri Chitra or fenestration results of this one. But the hybrid debranching is something which most of us can do. So I'm comfortable with hybrid approach. So my topic is also today is on hybrid approach. The almost all arch aneurysms, the initial presentation itself will be a hoarseness of voice only, and majority of the patient would have gone to the ENT, and incidental pickup is the arch aneurysm. And some patients can have a pain and rupture symptom. Most of them, they don't survive. So what are the important aspects when we are dealing with arch aneurysms? So first we have to see what is the neck and what all the zones involved, and whether the aneurysm is in the inner curvature or it's circumferential. Whether the vertebral is dominant on left side, that is very important because if you have to do a carotid subclavian bypass, that is one of the important aspects to determine. And also angulation of the arch and suitability for TEVAR device. And anatomy of the arch, whether it's a bovine arch or any aberrant subclavian artery or anything is there, we need to assess them. So just giving a picture, like this patient has a inner curvature. So in this case, you can just do bifurcated. If the landing zone is not adequate, you have to do a 3-vessel debranching, ascending aorta to innominate and left carotid and carotid to subclavian. when the saccular aneurysm is there on the inner curvature like this, we may as well avoid even ligating the vertebral, ligating the subclavian proximal to vertebral, because it is not possible in all the cases. In some cases, the anatomy will be very difficult, and in a couple of my cases, I ended up ligating distal to the vertebral. But on table, I thought I ligated proximal, but probably because of the some other branch, I got confused. So in an inner curvature arch aneurysm like this, you can actually avoid this one. If there is endoleak, you can always come back and put a device. But if the aneurysm is circumferential, then the plugging or ligation of the subclavian is a must. If the anatomy is anatomical variation is there, like you can use the configuration in different ways. If there is aberrant right subclavian artery, you can use the bifurcated limb graft, one to the aberrant subclavian artery and then to the right carotid, and from the left border of ascending aorta, you can take the graft to the left carotid and then go for TWAR. So as I was mentioning, the inner curvature saccular aneurysm, most of the aneurysms, majority of the arch aneurysms are saccular, and majority of them are along the inner curvature. So if the landing zone is adequate, or from the left carotid, that is very important. Left subclavian, in almost all cases, you can take it for granted. Like if needed, you can close. If needed, you can revascularize. In a case like this where there is adequate landing zone, you can just do a TWAR. And watch for any upper limb ischemic symptoms, or if you use a short 100 or 150, you don't need you need not worry about spinal complications also. But in a circumferential saccular aneurysm like this, you need to ligate the subclavian proximal to the vertebral, or you need to come from the brachial or the carotid subclavian bypass graft to put a plug-in device to the left subclavian origin. Otherwise, endoleak will be there. So you can do the debranching of a single vessel, 2 vessel, or 3 vessel. In double vessel debranching, in this case, the landing zone, as I told, it looks good in this view that there is adequate landing zone. We can just cover the left subclavian. But along the inner curvature, it is hardly about 8 mm. So the chances of covering the left carotid or endoleak is there. So we have to do a 2 vessel debranching. In 2 vessel debranching, you do carotid to carotid and carotid to subclavian bypass. This carotid to carotid and bypass can be done retroesophageal or pretracheal, whichever one is comfortable, and carotid to subclavian through a supraclavicular incision. In one of the cases, we have done a transposition. So where we mobilize the entire length of left carotid, and this tube you can see it's in the retroesophageal tunnel. Right common carotid artery, left common carotid artery has been transpositioned retroesophageally and anastomosed into side. Retroesophageal tunnel. Langenberg retractor. This is the left side common carotid artery, and this is the graft from this common carotid artery to subclavian artery as a part of hybrid repair. So then once the debranching is done, you can take in the device and cover the up to the innominate. So on the follow-up, if this patient has a left radial pulse, that means the entire circuit is patent. So this is the innominate supplying then carotid to carotid transposition and carotid to subclavian bypass. Another case where anatomical variation I have taken. So in this case, there is a aberrant right subclavian artery. So, and this angulation anatomy is what I was mentioning. It's a difficult angulation for a TWAR device to track in. But this patient, we were contemplating between open repair and hybrid repair. So ideally, I feel open repair in a high volume center would have been a better option. But since we were worried about, our center doesn't do that many open repairs for this kind of aneurysms. So we were comfortable with this. So we took a chance and we did a hybrid approach in this case. So you can see a huge saccular aneurysm in the distal part of the arch. This is the aberrant right subclavian artery. So arising from the aneurysm. And this is the left subclavian artery. Origin is aneurysmal here, and this is the aberrant right subclavian artery. So our plan was to take a bifurcated Dacron graft and from the right border of the ascending aorta to the aberrant subclavian artery and to the right carotid artery. And from the left border of the same bifurcated graft, you can cut the tube and anastomose from the left border to left carotid artery. So, and also we always do in stages. It's only because of our setup is not a hybrid setup. Even if it was a hybrid setup also, we prefer, because whatever said and done, the 2 to 4% risk of stroke and all will be there. You put a 5 lakh to 6 lakhs device and ending up with the patient with a stroke may not be a good acceptance from the patient point of view and attendance point of view. So we do a debranching and extubate the patient next day, same day, and watch the symptoms. And 48 hours later, we take him for TWAR. So in this case, there were certain issues, like, when we do debranching to the aberrant artery, should we ligate this artery here? Because we don't know where the vertebral is taken off. It's very difficult to dissect this part of the aberrant right subclavian artery. So we did a side-to-side anastomosis here. And carotid subclavian bypass, if I do in the same sitting, by the time 48 hours later, if I come for the TWAR, because of the competitive flow in the aneurysmal left subclavian artery, so our graft might have, it might shut down. So we reserved the carotid subclavian bypass to the day of this one, TWAR. So this is the thing. So right border ascending bifurcated graft we had taken, and left border to the left carotid artery. So then 48 hours later, we have taken him for a TWAR. You can see the huge sacral aneurysm, almost acute angled arch. And for any arch aneurysms, so one of the tip is Lundquist wire is a must, I feel. So without that, possibly this case wouldn't have been possible without a Lundquist wire. In fact, for any arch aneurysms, I feel Lundquist wire is a must. Nothing else tracks like that. See the resistance here. And also another thing you can see here, the radio opaque markers, what you're seeing is what the clips, vessel clips we put on the adventitia of the ascending aorta. So just above the our anastomotic takeoff, so that you need not waste contrast. You can get the graph. This is the covered portion. You can start deploying the covered portion from this clips. So below this clips is our anastomosis. Whenever we do out of indication or out of box cases, like we expect complications like this. So in this case, we could not retrieve the device so easily. So we had to change the Lundquist wire to a Terumo wire. So once we changed the wire to the Terumo wire, then the angulation was changed, and then we could retrieve the device. You can see here patent grafts. And now left subclavian origin was aneurysmal, and this is the left vertebral. So we have taken a septal device closure device, and brachial cut down, and deployed a device in the left subclavian origin, which is aneurysmal. And right brachial also was cut down, and we came from the right brachial and passed beyond the anastomosis here, and this is the aberrant right subclavian artery. And you can see the amplexer plug being deployed almost close to the aneurysm. This is the completion angio. showing all the grafts patent. So this is the 1 year, 6 months follow-up scan. Ascending aorta to the right abundant right subclavian and right carotid, and this one ascending aorta to left carotid and carotid to subclavian with the device in situ and absolutely no endo leak. Aneurysm is excluded. In modifications from the thing, in this case, ascending aorta was also involved. So we had teamed with our cardiac surgery colleagues, and they had replaced the ascending aorta. And from that graft, we had taken the this one and debranched, and then TVAR extended all the way up to this graft. And another case, if the left subclavian is not so easily accessible from the sternal incision, but in some of the cases, very rarely, only one of my case, subclavian origin was relatively accessible. This is the only case where we are done from the left border of the ascending aorta to the left subclavian anastomosis, all anastomosis within the sternum. But this is not possible in most of the cases. This was the only case where we are done in the sternum, rest all in the neck only, carotid subclavian. So you deserve, you expect things like this, nice, non-angulated bifurcated graft like this, lying graft without any kink, okay, and vertebral being patent. This is the picture one need to expect the post procedure. I thank my family and my teachers and my mentors. Thank you, Vask.
I think Dr. Shiva and Murali, I think am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So I think all three, I should say, Siddharth already made a few comments. Shiva and Murali, you've done wonderful presentations and most challenging situations in aortic arch, as well as the last but one case we showed. I think it's challenging anywhere in the world, however experienced the operator is. You've come through very well, and congratulations on that point, and many other cases that you have done. And Shiva's experience also building up. I have suggestions and comments about Murali's rather than Shiva's, because Shiva was with me and we have done several cases together. Only thing is, if for completion's sake, in thoracoabdominal, people try the MFM graft, the multi-layered, what do you call that? Multi-layered flow diverter. But the thing is, I have found that it is a failure in most literature. But recently, when I looked up, I found 98% of perioperative success. I don't know how it gets, but the blood supply to celiac and renal, they are not adequate through this multi-layer. So anyway, let's forget it, only for theory exam. So coming to Murali's presentation, few things I have little different opinion. Number one, the literature mentions 2 centimeter proximal landing zone for arch situations because the hemodynamic stress, the blood pressure changes, and the angulation. So safety is 2 centimeter. But personally, I used to use 3 centimeter because I should end up debranch sufficiently and use only one stent graft. And then there is a chance for retrograde aortic arch dissection if you are not sufficiently going onto the mid-arch. So basically in arch, I consider either it's zone 0 where you have to cover innominate or zone 1. No other zones I use so that I appropriately do the debranching. But I suppose there can be a difference of opinion. For me, one graft, it's costing 5 lakhs. You cannot just do it if it's not adequate. So we give 3 centimeter to be on the sure side, so there is no migration. No 1A endoleak, which is going to be very dangerous. That's what I've, and then 1 or 2 cases early in my experience, I have tried to ligate subclavian. After that, I've decided never to ligate subclavian. Never do. People have lost tear of the subclavian artery, and you can never get proximal to the vertebral artery. So best thing is either you try to intentionally occlude subclavian if it's needed, give a bypass graft, or if you find the endo leak, Then transbrachally, you put a coil or something at the base. So I think it is safer not to go for ligating subclavian, as Murali has nicely said. Then another thing in Stanford B, particularly in acute and subacute situation, it's always better to graft subclavian and definitely do carotid to subclavian, or still better, carotid to carotid and subclavian have a zone 1 deployment, because in dissection, as we all know, there's more chance for paraplegia. So subclavian and vertebral basilar system has to contribute for the stability and integrity of the spinal cord, and the paraplegia occurs because we are not bypassing the subclavian and occluding it. Then I think I quite agree with most of what Murali's practice is, like leaving clips. Secondly, staging it. Staging is mandatory for the right reasons you said. What I do slightly different is do the procedure, adequate debranching for a 3 centimeter landing zone, ventilate him, but after 4-5 hours, make sure he's awake, pupils are working, no deficit, continue with sedation overnight, morning take him up for surgery, so that by afternoon he can be extubated. So these are the little finer things, but I suppose it has to be patient-centric, individualized to the anatomy and to the system that you're working and to the team you have. But for me, I see it's very difficult to go for a second graft, and the cost is prohibitive, the kind of cases we get. But most of the time, almost except one, we almost always done single graft adequate debranching without 1A endoleak. That's something, and I have completed 75 aortic hybrids in now 4 or 5 in SUT. We've had a lot more cases in Srijitra, of course. So I think I will stop my comments here. Terrific session today. Incredible presentation by the younger future vascular torchbearers for our society. As a president and personally, I congratulate Siddharth, Shiva, and Murali. I can see the bright, committed people, and I think our specialty, it will be named vascular and endovascular surgery for the right reasons. And so I congratulate you, and I'm very happy to be, to be chairing this, and Sidhu and RC for making this webinar happen. Congratulations, all of you. I think I'll stop my comments, and there are more comments coming. Nandan is still there, or I don't see Nandan's face. I think further comments.
I'm here, sir. I'm here.
Okay, Nandan. I think we would like your comments. This is all what we have to do. We have to face.
I mean, in the UK, vascular surgeons don't deal with the thoracic aorta, to be honest. So your experience mine is just theoretical. But Siddharth, your presentation was truly excellent. I mean, all speakers were great. The only thing I would like to ask Siddharth or add to it is, for dissections, we have very strict protocols here, because they present to any small hospital, and they then have to be transferred centrally. All the work is centralized. So when we do blood pressure control, we get a CT scan, like you said. And for blood pressure control, we have very strict criteria, and the patients are monitored on HDU. The blood pressure is invasively monitored. That was the only thing I would like to add. I don't know if you have the same practice there, but blood pressure control is vital. Analgesia is vital, and the patient needs to be regularly monitored, like urine output and all that. And all that is ideally done in HDU. And it is all protocol driven. So entire Yorkshire has one protocol, and we all follow the same protocol. Sid, you're aware of that. Sid,
absolutely, Mr. Haldipur. Yeah. And I think it's best to treat them, even if you're treating medically, in a center where intervention is also possible, because if the patient were to deteriorate, you should be able to intervene as well. So yes, definitely in an HDU setting with all invasive lines and all possible monitoring.
Yeah, Nandan, I may add, what we do is we have a radial artery, central venous line to give vasodilators, then use injectable beta blockers, and have a catheter, serial monitoring of creatinine, systolic pressure close to 100, and making sure we have adequate urine output as is 30-40 cc per hour, and creatinine is stable. That has to be done for 2-3 days, then relegate to oral tablets, beta blockers. That's strictly done.
And the other thing that I wanted to tell was Murali, we use Lundequist routinely for our aortic aneurysms, and it straightens the thing, and it's a really good. Yeah, so ours is Terumo only to cross any lesion, and after that it's Lundequist and Lundequist right through to the end.
Yes. True. Lundequist is a wonderful visor. Without that, I think like at least few arch aneurysms are impossible. You can do, but it is a very scary. Lundequist gives a very good trackability.
Especially the case which you presented last but one is almost like a hairpin turn.
Correct.
Getting into the ascending aorta, and there's a lot of resistance. We have faced it once or twice. I even thought once I perforated the aorta because that much force was needed. It's a hairpin bend.
Correct.
And very challenging, very challenging. Very nicely done.
Thank you, sir.
Hello.
Yes. One thing I should congratulate. Hello?
Yeah.
RC, go on.
One thing we should, VASC is so happy that today we have 3 young vascular heads of South India, and they are the young leaders of the specialty in 3 major institutes. Murali is a professor of vascular endovascular in Jayadeva Institute of Cardiology, and today is our guest. Excellent presentation, Murali, and Sivanesan also, Siddharth Sivanesan also. Wonderful presentations. Thanks to you on behalf of VASC. Anyway, the number is quite less because pupil interest in thoracic aorta is very, very less nowadays due to various reasons, and only few centers are doing it also. My question is, what is your policy regarding management of endoleaks in thoracic aorta? Murali, any in principle?
Can you repeat the question, sir?
Regarding management of endoleaks, what's the policy in management?
Arch aneurysm, as Unni sir has told, if you have a good neck, or if you create a good neck by debranching, virtually endoleak is not there. And preferably if the graft comes from ascending aorta, distal part of ascending aorta, it gives a nice sealing there. So it's very rare to see a endoleak in arch aneurysms. Only from there can be an endoleak from the subclavian origin that you can tackle easily. And sometimes there can be a vertebral arising directly from arch. So that is another complex case scenario. If you have to, I have never encountered theoretically, but you can just put a coil there and then go ahead with the TWAR.
Okay. Thank you, Murali.
Thank you, sir.
I think planning is very important, sir, in the thoracic aorta. If you have any suspicion of inadequate coverage, always go for the zone, the extra forward zone, rather than take a chance with a shorter zone. So because that is often the time when people end up having an endoleak by doing inadequate zone coverage.
Planning is the most important thing for planning. That's the most important part of management of thoracic aorta. Yes. And Shiva is known for that. Shiva is a very good planner also.
Hello, Murali.
Thank you.
Tell me.
Sunil here. Hello. Yeah, nice presentation, Murali. Just wanted to know what is the strategy for reducing the pressures when you deploy the stent in the arch? Like,
to be honest, I never done pacing, but doing a pacing is a very good idea. But I not done.
What do you do actually?
So, I used almost except one. All the rest of the 120 plus endo devices, what I used only Medtronic. I'm very comfortable with the device. That is number one. And keep the steady left hand on the proximal part, and don't do rapid deployment. Do it slowly. And have one assistant just support the end of the device where the wire comes out, right? So there you ask the assistant to just keep one finger there. So that gives almost a good landing, and your eyes should be on the monitor continuously. But many experts, like, they recommend pacing, but I'm not done a pacing in any of my cases, because that adds to the cost, and again you have to involve the cardiologist.
In fact, I think what generally we were doing in Srijitra is keep systolic pressure between 60 to 70 using SNP or NTG or a mix. But in last 4 cases, I have done a SUT. We have used adenosine. That gives you 3 minutes of cardiac inactivity. And also in 1 or 2 cases, we have used RV pacing at 240 per minute. So as long as the pacing is going, you have a standstill circulation. You can do a perfect deployment, first 2 struts. Then in the relay graph, which I did last, the whole rest of the things, once you're happy with the position, it comes within 10 seconds. Unlike Medtronic, it comes slowly. So we can use 3, all 3 we have used, but majority in Srijitra, we have used SNP and adenosine just once. But here cardiologists are there. The team is cardiologist and me. So they are happy with pacing in the femoral vein route. And we use adenosine twice and pacing twice. So they give you a perfect landing with just totally no circulation state. And you stop pacing, heart picks up. Adenosine gives you 2 to 3 minutes time.
But I think Sir Murali has given a good message that we can do without cardiology and all this high-end stuff. We can even manage without any of this.
See, that is
actually
endovascular.
More confidence to the vascular surgeon.
Yeah, no doubt about it. See, vasculars, we are little old-timers and ancient. I'm 100% agree. We believe in strong, open, and since 65 years not the age to start catheter trials. So always I have a combination of interventional radiologist or cardiologist so that my burden is less. But I take the graft up to ascending aorta, then leave it to them to modify and finally deploy so that they also feel they are part of the thing. Cut down is done, graft is taken, right up to the ascending aorta for the arch. So that is because of training and the outlook. We are unlike your generation. We are definitely old-fashioned and ancient, and we are less of endovascular surgeons, more of open surgeons.
Again, sir, about the thoracoabdominal results are actually great. Actually, it's I think largest number in India. They started by KSN, sir, you, and then RC, and then Shiva. Great numbers and good result. So Shivanesh, anyway, nice talk and continuing the legacy of SCT and doing more of complex thoracoabdominal. That actually makes all of us proud.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Shiva.
Thank you.
Siddharth, again, nice crisp talk. As RC said, next head of vascular division in Amrita. That's also nice. So congratulations to all the 3 speakers.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing that I feel so happy and Siddharth today, Murali and Shiva, and I share my happiness that I have been asked to be a special invitee for National Medical Council and the deployment DNB examinations. That's number 1. Then I am now member of task force for World Federation of Vascular Societies. So I feel happy sitting this evening's program than whatever they have, requested me to join. That is only in words. But today I feel very happy listening and conducting the conference, and I think the way you have progressed and absolutely amazing work all 3 of you are doing. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you, sir.
Let me quickly share the previous winners of the previous webinar. So we have a couple of winners. So yeah, so the last talk on abdominal aneurysm, last session, the winners were Dr. Ashwini Naveen, who is presently, I think, a fellow at Doncaster Royal Infirmary in the UK, and Dr. Rahul Agarwal, who's working at Care Hospital in Hyderabad. So both of them will win a prize money of rupees 2,500 each. Congratulations to the winners. And I also encourage today's participants and viewers to please take part in the quiz. The link is shared in the chat box. and all of you stand a chance at winning the quiz as well. And we'll announce the winners in the next session. So all of you, please go for the quiz. That is, the link is in the chat box. So at the same time, let me also take this opportunity to announce the next webinar. This will be on venous disease. We have chosen the 3rd of February as the schedule for this session. It will be dedicated to varicose veins and superficial venous disease. So 3rd of Feb, 7 to 8 p.m. And also, I would like to thank our sponsors, industry sponsors for this talk, Cook Medical, who are also have quite a lot of inventory for thoracic aortic aneurysm work. So, is there any more questions from the chat box coming, or are we? Any audience? Any more questions? The link is put up again in the chat box. So please, all of you, please attend it. So there's no more questions. Shall we call it a day, sir?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Unni sir, for being present today as a moderator. I think we had a very good discussion on thoracic aortic aneurysms. And Murli sir, for your presence today as well. And it was an excellent talk on hybrid arch, and we learned a lot from the various techniques you have employed to deal with some of the complex anatomy. So thank you again, Shiva. Your work and your is well shown in your presentation. And thank you all of you for joining as well, and hope you have a good night. So see you again for the next session on the 3rd of February. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.